Hi everyone, this is the Conflicted Critic with my second video of this YouTube channel. So first of all, an apology. It took me a lot of time to upload my second video after my first one, and it's all got to do with my choice of book. The book that I've selected for this video took me a lot of time to digest, a lot of time to think and ponder over, and to completely come to grips with, because this book is by the great Friedrich Nietzsche, and it happens to be one of his most erratic and one of his most dense pieces of literature ever. And critics also consider it to be one of his most vast books because it has such a huge amount of ideals and knowledge and discourses and poetry. It's an intermingling of different forms of literature, and it is very heavy literature. It's difficult to come to grips with. It also happened to be Nietzsche's last piece of literature, after which he lost his mental abilities and his mental soundness. And after this book, he wasn't able to write ever in his life, or even participate in a discourse or a discussion or a lecture. So yeah, this book had a toll on him, and you could imagine the toll it has on its readers. So we'll start with a brief introduction about the book. The book is about a self-proclaimed prophet by the name of Zarathustra, who, after a certain amount of time meditating in the mountains, comes to a very stark realization. The stark realization being that God is dead. And as soon as he realizes this, it's basically a revelation that comes to him. And when this revelation comes to him, he rushes to the marketplace where he starts dispelling this notion and this idea that has stirred him up. And the marketplace chooses to ignore him. And because of this initial ignorance, because of this initial derision by the marketplace, Zarathustra then sets off on a journey where he meets different people, where some people become his disciples, where some people become his opposers and abusers. But ultimately, it's a book about Zarathustra's ideals, his thoughts and opinions about matters pertaining to emotions, intellect, ideals, everything. So it's basically, Zarathustra is basically Nietzsche's self portrait. And whatever Nietzsche wants to think, wants to say, he says it through the eyes and ears and words of Zarathustra. So there are several key concepts that this book discusses, and key metaphors or statements, you could say. The first statement being, God is dead. I bring you the Superman. So this is the proclamation that Zarathustra declares in front of the people of the marketplace. Now, is this a metaphor, or does this have a higher meaning? Does it have a practical meaning? Does it have a practicality hidden inside? And throughout the book, Zarathustra, or Nietzsche, tries to explain what he really means by this single statement. And what Nietzsche really means by the statement is that the conception of God that previously existed in man has now ceased to exist because of man's littleness. Man has attached reward and punishment and value and calculation to things that are boundless, things like virtue, things like life, right? And he categorizes these men by giving them certain titles. He gives them the titles of afterworldsmen, he gives them the titles of preachers of virtue, and he gives them this sort of derision and the sneer, and warns individuals and people from you know falling into their traps, falling into their discourses or their discussions. Now, the second part of the statement, after the first statement that God is dead. The second part of the statement is, I bring you the Superman. Now, what is the Superman? What is the higher man? What is the conception of higher man? What is the original idea of higher man? Now, the entire book, a huge amount of the chapters are prescribed and are aimed towards the evolution of the higher man, right? The higher man is an individual, according to Nietzsche, who is not bound by any eternal will. He is a creating will. He creates his past, he creates his present, he creates his future, and he wholly believes, to his utmost senses and capabilities, that whatever has happened to him in the past, whatever is happening to him in the present, and whatever will happen to him in the future is because he willed it to have happened, right? And this realization is so difficult to achieve in common men, that Nietzsche believes that none of the men in the rabble or in the crowd can ever achieve the status of a higher man, because they will never be developed in such a way or will reach that certain height in which they will ever come to believe that whatever has happened to them so far, whatever situations or circumstances that they've been through, has been because they had willed it to have happened as such. Again, a very easy to grasp statement or concept, but ultimately it's extremely difficult to fully understand it. Then, after the conception of the higher man, Zarathustra or Nietzsche pr- basically prohibits the higher man from intermingling or associating himself with the crowd or the rabble or the superfluous men. Now, who are the superfluous men? The superfluous men are the multitudes of individuals who are governed by organizations and establishments that pull their strings. So, basically, the state. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to the state and how it owns the creations of individual creators, because the state believes that it has a moral responsibility and right of governance over the individuality of creators. And because the state believes it has a moral obligation and moral right to do so, it is able to influence and pull the strings of thousands and thousands of individuals who create the rabble or the crowd. And this rabble is dominated by noise and commotion and hustle and bustle, but there is no time for introspection and reconciliation. So, this is basically Nietzsche's imagination of the rabble or the crowd, and he himself realizes it to a certain extent in the book, that the crowd is essential for the development of the higher man, because if there is no crowd, there is no need for a higher man, and if there is no higher man, then there is no evolution of man, right? So the rabble, in some ways, even if it is very displeasing for Nietzsche, it is very essential for the higher man too. So yeah, the rabble is important for reality, and the reality that we currently live in feeds and relishes the rabble. Then you talk about another very unique sequence of events in Nietzsche's Spoke Zarathustra, which talks about the Last Supper, which is basically Nietzsche taking a story or an incident from Christian mythology and making a mockery out of it. So Nietzsche's criticism regarding Christianity and its ideals of atonement and retribution, are well publicized, and he sort of transforms this very unique event in Christian mythology into something that becomes an amalgamation of Zarathustra's inner self. There's different facets, and there's different alter egos of Zarathustra who are conversing together, who are basically reflections of the higher man, right? And this entire conversation is very interesting, but the most unique aspect of this entire sequence is the chapter on the ugliest man, and that pertains to the idea of pity. So, Zarathustra basically advocates the higher man to avoid himself from falling into the chaos of the rabble because of two main diseases that he believes the rabble always finds itself indulged in, which is suffering and indulgence, right? And both of these afflictions ultimately lead to the greater affliction, which is pity. Now, why does the ugliest man feel the need to basically, first of all, why is the ugliest man called the ugliest man? It is because he murders God. And why does he murder God? He murders God because he realizes the extent and extravagance of pity that God has for his creations, because he realizes the depth to which mankind can fall and does fall repeatedly. And because of this depth of melancholy, this depth of suffering, this depth of humiliation, God has an immensity of pity for his creations. And the ugliest man realizes that, and the ugliest man ultimately has to murder God to preserve his sanity and to preserve his own intellect, you could say, or clarity, you could say. And this realization through this chapter is so deep and is so dark that we have all murdered this conception of God within us just to maintain our level of sanity and our level of clarity. It was one of the most dark and most gruesome realities that I've ever come across. Then we come towards the noontide, which is basically a revolution in which man finally evolves into the higher man, and the higher man assumes control over the rabble or the crowd. And basically, once the higher man attains control over the rabble, the end is nigh, the end is near. Because once the rabble is overcome, reality ceases to exist. Because reality is nothing without the rabble, and the rabble is nothing without the reality. So once this happens, according to Nietzsche, the process of eternal recurrence occurs. Everything happens again with the exact same details, with the exact same progression, with the exact same characters, because according to Nietzsche, there's no divergence, there's no change, it is a circle. There's no linear progression from one world to the other. It will happen again, it will happen the same way as it has happened for eons and eons. So, yeah, even though I've tried to give you a summary of the dense material that was present in this book, but the true realization would only be accessible once you read this book to its utmost extent, once you fully understand the ideals and the preachings that are present in this book and try to apply it to your own selves. So, yeah, this concludes our review of Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. Personally, reading this book was one of my most darkest experiences, as well as one of my most enlightening experiences, because even though it made me go through this process of dark realizations, which were very difficult to digest, but ultimately it made me ascend to this platform and to this space where I was able to reconcile with my true self and with my true identity. And people who are attracted to this brand of philosophy that sort of makes them revisit their ideals, rethink about their ideals, and develop this penitence of spirit that is very strongly advocated in this book. I'd recommend this book to you. I'd recommend you to read this book at a time in which you're comfortable, in which you're not in a state of, you know, uh, in at a time where you're unsure about yourself, unsure about your feelings. when you're easy, when you're comfortable, I'd recommend this book to you. I'd recommend these preachings, these ideals, and yeah. So this was my book review about The Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll meet again shortly for a read along that I've planned for this book, because two of my favorite chapters uh, are present in this book, and I read it to you guys. And after that, I also have a plan to delve into some fiction, just to have some light-hearted fun. So yeah, until the next time we meet, have a very good reading experience. Goodbye.